What if I told you that for decades, a machine the size of a Boeing 747 skimmed across the surface of the Caspian Sea at 300 miles per hour, invisible to radar, carrying 500 tons of weapons and troops, and that neither NATO nor the CIA had any idea it existed until a spy satellite accidentally photographed it from orbit in the 1960s, and that the analyst who first saw the image thought the photo was broken. They called it the Caspian monster, the KM, a thing so large, so impossible looking that Western intelligence assumed it was a mistake. It was not a mistake. It was the most radical rethinking of how to move mass across the surface of the Earth that the 20th century ever produced. It was the Ekranoplan, and the reason you have never heard of it is one of the most fascinating engineering tragedies in modern history. Subscribe to Lost Tech Vault and hit like. This is exactly the kind of buried engineering story we exist to tell. Here is how it actually works, because the physics is where the story lives. When a wing moves through air fast enough, it generates lift. You learned this in school. What they did not teach you is what happens when that wing gets very close to a flat surface, water, ice, flat desert. Something extraordinary occurs. The air beneath the wing cannot escape sideways as easily. It compresses, it builds, it becomes a cushion, a pressurized ram of air trapped between the wing and the ground. Engineers call this the ground effect. Pilots who accidentally discover it call it terrifying. Soviet engineers in the 1960s called it an opportunity. A vehicle flying in ground effect does not need nearly as much power to stay aloft. The compressed air does the lifting work that fuel would otherwise do. You can carry more. You can fly lower. You become essentially invisible to radar because you are below the radar horizon, skimming 10 feet above the surface of the sea at the speed of a jet aircraft. You are not a boat. You are not a plane. You are something the world had no word for. Rostislav Alexeyev was the man who turned this physics into hardware. A Soviet naval engineer who had already revolutionized hydrofoil design, Alexeyev became obsessed with the ground effect in the 1950s. He understood what nobody else would commit to. A vehicle optimized entirely for flight within 10 meters of the sea surface could achieve something no existing technology could match. The speed of an aircraft, the payload of a ship, the radar invisibility of nothing, and the fuel efficiency that made both of the previous two things affordable at military scale. By 1966, his team had built the KM, the Korabl Maquette, or ship prototype. 100 meters long, 550 tons, 8 turbojet engines mounted on its forward fuselage, blasting it forward until the ground effect kicked in and the hull lifted off the water. At full speed, it was the heaviest aircraft ever flown. It made absolutely no sense, and it worked exactly as predicted. The Soviet military immediately understood the strategic implications. An Ekranoplan could cross the Caspian Sea, a body of water roughly the size of Japan, in about an hour. It could deliver tanks, troops and missiles to any point on any coastline that body of water touched. It could not be tracked by conventional radar. It could not be intercepted by submarines because it was not in the water. It could not easily be intercepted by aircraft because it flew below their engagement envelopes. In the military geography of the Cold War, where the Caspian connected Soviet territory to Iran, Afghanistan, and a dozen pressure points the Kremlin cared deeply about, this was not a novelty. This was a weapon. The follow-on machine, the Lun, made the stakes explicit. Where the KM was a prototype, the Lun was a missile platform. 90 meters long, 380 tons, 6 P-270 Moskit anti-ship missiles mounted on its back like a flying destroyer. A single Lun could race across the surface of the sea at 340 miles per hour, launch 6 supersonic missiles, and be gone before any conventional naval response could be organized. The NATO alliance had no answer for it. The technology did not fit into any existing threat category. You cannot shoot down what you cannot see. You cannot torpedo what never enters the water. So why did it disappear? The answer is not that it failed. The answer is that the Soviet Union did. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, the entire Ekranoplan program lost its institutional home overnight. The funding stopped, the design bureaus scattered, the engineers retired or emigrated, the political will to maintain a fleet of machines that required their own category of maritime law, their own pilot certification program, their own maintenance infrastructure, simply evaporated with the government that had created it. The Lun was mothballed in Caspian. The remaining KM descendants were left to rust or were stripped for parts. Alexeyev himself had already died in 1980, killed in a collision during a test run of a smaller passenger Ekranoplan. A collision that many in the program believed was not entirely accidental, the result of political enemies who resented his budget and his influence. The institutional knowledge he had spent 30 years building had no single successor who could fight for it. There is also a harder technical truth that the program's advocates tend to minimize. Ekranoplans are extraordinarily demanding to operate. Flying 10 feet above the water at 300 miles per hour in rough sea states is not a problem that physics solves gently. The machines required exceptionally skilled pilots and suffered from serious stability challenges in anything beyond calm conditions. The Caspian Sea, for all its strategic value, is also one of the most unpredictable bodies of water on Earth in terms of storm development. Designing a vehicle that is neither a boat nor a plane means it inherits the vulnerability profile of both without fully enjoying the safety margin of either. And then there was the bureaucratic no man's land. Ekranoplans were too fast and too airborne to be regulated as ships. They were too low and too heavy to be regulated as aircraft. Every nation that might have adopted them faced a version of the same institutional question. Whose budget does this come from? Whose ministry owns it? And who is responsible when something goes wrong? That question killed more promising technologies in the 20th century than any engineering flaw ever did. What makes the Ekranoplan story genuinely haunting is not what was lost. It is what is being rebuilt. China has been investing aggressively in ground effect vehicle technology for over a decade, openly discussing military applications in the South China Sea that mirror almost exactly what the Soviets envisioned for the Caspian. The United States government has funded classified feasibility studies. Australian startup Regent Craft is building commercial ground effect sea gliders for coastal passenger transport, with FAA certification underway. Boeing and Airbus have both quietly held internal research programs. The physics has not changed. The ground effect still works exactly as Alexeyev demonstrated. A wing near a surface still generates that pressurized cushion of air. The fuel efficiency advantage is still real. The radar invisibility is still a strategic asset that no other technology replicates. What has changed is materials science, computational fluid dynamics, and electric propulsion, three fields that did not exist in useful form when the KM first skimmed the Caspian. The stability problems that made Ekranoplans dangerous in rough water are engineering problems, not physics problems. Engineering problems get solved. The Soviet Union built machines that no nation on Earth had the vision or the institutional courage to replicate for 30 years. They sat in the grey zone between sea and sky, between ship and aircraft, between possible and impossible, and they worked. They were abandoned, not because they were wrong, but because the civilization that built them ran out of time. Somewhere in the shallow water off the coast of Dagestan, the Lun still sits, grounded, weathering, still enormous, still waiting for someone to remember what it proved. The sea is not empty, and the sky above it is closer than you think. Lost Tech Vault covers the engineering stories that history forgot. If this one hit different, subscribe and leave a comment. Should we cover the Soviet nuclear-powered bomber next?